Well, hey, Grace family. This past weekend, I spoke about a new concept for some of us, probably something that some of you have heard about before, but I think it's a very appropriate concept for us to wrestle with as we face this pandemic, this global pandemic. And the concept is lament, specifically biblical lament. If you heard my sermon, you know that I was speaking mostly from Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is a psalm of David where he laments the brokenness around him, the pain that he's feeling, the confusion, the loss, and what that lament looks like is asking God, where are you? God, why aren't you coming through for me? You came through for my ancestors. Where are you now? And what I talked about is the fact that in Scripture, biblical lament is not just griping. It's also a matter of trust. I introduced lament as brutal honesty on one hand, but unwavering trust on another. Because when you look at Psalm 22, you see that David, he shifts back and forth from essentially shaking his fist at God to basically declaring that he's going to trust God no matter what. He trusts that God is going to come through for him. And so I find it so interesting to consider that Scripture invites us to experience that as a way of our relationship from God being enacted. We lament the brokenness of our world, and yet that should push us into trusting Him. And so if you and your groups are talking about this, what I'd love for you to discuss is what of this makes you uncomfortable and what of this fires you up? What of this aspect of the idea of lament gives you hope or courage? Is it weird for you to consider asking God why He's failing you? I mean, that seems like a pretty intense thing to do. I'd love for you to talk about that. And one other thing that I'd love for you to consider discussing, something I didn't really get into in this message, is what are we? There's an aspect in Psalm 22 and biblical lament in general that is essentially the idea that when our expectation, when our brokenness is greatest, that is also where if we have trust in God, that's where we have the greatest hope. So in the greatest despair, we have the greatest opportunity for Yahweh to save us. And that's a mentality that the biblical writers have that I don't think we always think of. We tend to think that when there's greatest despair, that means that God is failing the greatest. But it also, in a sense, when you put it in the context of trust, means that it's an opportunity for God to save us even more spectacularly than before. So maybe something to think about. Does brokenness breed hope if we have a right relationship with God? Something to wrestle with and ponder as you talk in your groups. But mostly I hope as a group that you will take some time to lament the brokenness around us. Don't move on too quickly into problem solving and solutions and joy. Let's take some time as a community to really sit in this, because I believe that when we do, we are opening the door for greater trust and greater expectation that God will ultimately save.